Picture this. You are standing in the freezing dust of the Syrian desert. It is December 1299. You are a Mamluk cavalryman encased in heavy steel, your warhorse shifting nervously beneath you. But you are not looking at the barren landscape. You are staring at a wall of brown earth rising into the sky, blotting out the sun. That is not a sandstorm. That is the Mongol war machine. 60,000 men and over 100,000 horses commanded by Ghazan Khan are thundering toward you to wipe your civilization off the map. You can feel the vibration in your teeth. You know the stories. You know what these monsters did to Baghdad. They did not just conquer it, they built pyramids out of human skulls and turned the rivers black with ink and red with blood. And now they are here for you. You grip your lance, there is nowhere to run. The greatest, most ruthless empire the world has ever seen is about to crash into your lines, and logic says you will be dead before the sun sets. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The wind howls across the Wadi al-Khazandar, carrying the stench of sweat, horse foam, and impending slaughter. To understand the sheer terror gripping the Mamluk lines, you have to understand the nightmare they are facing. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire is not just an army, it is a natural disaster. It is an apocalyptic force that has swallowed China, pulverized Russia, and dismantled the Islamic Golden Age piece by bloody piece. They do not fight to hold territory, they fight to exterminate resistance. They are faster, more brutal, and better organized than anything the world has ever produced. Their archers can shoot with lethal precision while riding at a full gallop, timing their release with the moment all four of their horses' hooves leave the ground. They carry multiple bows, dozens of arrows, and they do not stop moving. If you stand your ground, they turn you into a pincushion. If you charge, they retreat, shooting backward in the infamous Parthian shot, leading you into an exhausted, disorganized trap before butchering you. But the men waiting for them in the dirt of Kili are no ordinary soldiers. They are the Mamluks of Egypt and Syria. They are a living, breathing paradox of history. They were born as slaves, boys ripped from their homes in the Eurasian steppes, bought, sold and traded like livestock in the slave markets of Cairo. They were beaten, broken, and reforged in the brutal, uncompromising training grounds of the Sultanate. They spent their entire youth mastering the sword, the lance, and the bow until they emerged as the most elite, heavy cavalry on earth. They wear heavy lamellar armor that bakes in the sun and freezes in the winter. They are the only force that has ever looked the Mongol war machine in the eye and made it bleed. Decades earlier, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, they shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. They saved the world from total Mongol domination. But the Mongols never forget, and they never forgive. Now the Ilkhanate ruler, Ghazan Khan, has returned to finish the job. He is a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, possessing the same ruthless tactical genius, but armed with fresh fanaticism. He has dragged an army of battle-hardened veterans across the Euphrates River, intent on crushing the Mamluk Sultanate once and for all, aiming to seize the crown jewel of the Mediterranean, the city of Damascus. The stakes at Kili are absolute. There is no diplomatic solution. There is no surrender. If the Mamluk line breaks today, there is no backup plan. There is no other army waiting in the wings to stop the horde. The gates to Egypt, North Africa, and the holy cities of Islam will be kicked wide open, and the world order will be permanently erased. The Mongol ponies will drink from the Nile, and the Mamluk Sultanate will become nothing more than a footnote in a blood-soaked history book. The dust cloud is closer now, the deafening roar of 60,000 horsemen chanting and beating their kettle drums drowns out your own heartbeat. You are facing the apex predators of the medieval world. The enemy is fighting exactly on their terms in the wide open spaces of the Wadi al-Khazandar, where their endless mobility is an absolute death sentence for heavy cavalry. You watch the sky turn black as the first volley of 10,000 arrows is released, arcing through the air like a plague of iron locusts. This is the Battle of Kili, the terrifying prelude to a masterclass in strategic survival, and the day the unstoppable force finally met an immovable wall of flesh and steel. To call the Mongol Empire a military force is a fundamental misunderstanding of history. They were not an army, they were an industrialized slaughterhouse on horseback. When we picture the Mongols today, popular culture often paints them as a disorganized horde of screaming barbarians washing over the steppes. That is a comforting lie. Barbarians do not conquer the known world. The Mongols were a ruthlessly efficient, hyper-organized syndicate of death. They weaponized mathematics, logistics, and pure psychological terror better than any modern military. They did not just defeat their enemies, they unmade their civilizations. If a city opened its gates, the inhabitants were heavily taxed and absorbed. If a city closed its gates, the Mongols would systematically disassemble the population. They did not just kill the soldiers, they slaughtered the merchants, the farmers, the dogs, and the cats. They tore down the walls, burned the libraries, and redirected rivers to drown the ruins, ensuring that nothing would ever grow there again. They utilized terror as a strategic resource to save time and manpower. By the time the Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, most kings were already paralyzed by the horrifying certainty of their own extinction. By the winter of 1299, the unified Mongol Empire had fractured into massive, terrifying pieces, and the Middle East belonged to the Ilkhanate. This was the southwestern chunk of the Mongol war machine, stretching across modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Anatolia. At its helm was Ghazan Khan, a brilliant, ruthless, and highly educated warlord. Ghazan had recently converted to Islam, a move that some naive observers thought might soften the Ilkhanate's foreign policy toward its Muslim neighbors. Instead, Ghazan simply used his new faith as a geopolitical crowbar. He declared himself the rightful ruler of the Islamic world, pointing his blood-soaked war machine directly at the only power left standing in his way. That power was the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks were the last functioning heartbeat of free Islamic civilization. After the Mongols had obliterated Baghdad in 1258, extinguishing the Abbasid Caliphate and turning the Tigris River black with the ink of 1 million destroyed books, the center of gravity shifted to Cairo. Egypt and Syria became the final sanctuary for scholars, refugees, and wealth. The Mamluks were the guardians of this sanctuary, and they were the only reason the Mongols had not already watered their horses in the Atlantic Ocean. The Ilkhanate and the Mamluks had been locked in a grinding, brutal Cold War for decades, punctuated by spasms of extreme violence. Ghazan Khan was determined to end this stalemate. He wanted Syria, he wanted Egypt, he wanted the absolute monopoly over the trade routes connecting Europe to Asia. To achieve this, Ghazan assembled an invasion force that was practically a force of nature. 60,000 hardened Mongol cavalrymen crossed the Euphrates River, accompanied by thousands of conscripted infantry and vassal troops from Georgia and Armenia. They stripped the land bare as they marched, a locust swarm of iron and horseflesh descending upon the Levant. The sheer logistical nightmare of moving over 100,000 horses across a semi-arid landscape required absolute precision. The Mongols did not rely on slow, vulnerable supply wagons. They drank the blood of their own horses, ate dried meat, and moved with a terrifying velocity that shattered conventional military thinking. The ground trembled for miles ahead of their advance, pushing a wave of fleeing, desperate refugees toward the walls of Damascus. Standing in the path of this apocalypse was the Mamluk army of Syria, vastly outnumbered and painfully aware of their isolation. The young Sultan of Egypt, al-Nasir Muhammad, was marching north with the main Egyptian army, but the Syrian garrisons knew they were going to take the first devastating blow. They were staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. The Mamluks were not easily intimidated. They were professional killers who had spent their entire lives preparing for this exact moment. But even for them, the sight of Ghazan Khan's seemingly endless columns pouring into the plains was a reality check. The Mongols had learned from their past defeats. They were not going to underestimate the heavy cavalry of the Mamluks again. Ghazan had brought overwhelming numbers, superior mobility, and a burning desire to eradicate the Mamluk threat permanently. The stage was set for a collision that would either shatter the Mongol advance forever or plunge the rest of the world into an age of suffocating darkness. The geography of death is rarely a coincidence. If you wanted to design the perfect slaughterhouse for heavy cavalry, you would draw the Wadi al-Khazandar, located just north of Homs in central Syria. This is not a narrow mountain pass where a few brave men can hold the line against a larger force. It is a massive, unforgiving expanse of flat, hard-packed earth and gravel. There are no hills to anchor a flank. There are no dense forests to hide a reserve force or disrupt an enemy charge. There is only an ocean of dirt, stretching out under a pale, freezing winter sky. For the Mongols, this terrain was paradise. It was a blank canvas where they could paint their masterpiece of mobility, utilizing their superior numbers to encircle, exhaust, and exterminate. For the Mamluks, it was a giant, open grave. As the sun climbs higher on that freezing December morning, the psychological torture begins. Battles in the medieval world did not start instantly. They were preceded by hours of agonizing, nerve-shredding theater. Across the valley floor, the Mamluk soldiers sit on their armored horses, freezing in the biting winter wind. They are outnumbered roughly 3-1, and the silence of the desert is entirely broken by the sheer, deafening volume of the Mongol horde. It is not just the shouts of 60,000 men, it is the chaotic, terrifying symphony of over 100,000 horses. The Mongols have brought their remounts, vast herds of steppe ponies that scream, snort, and stamp their hooves, kicking up a wall of dust that makes the enemy army look like a localized hurricane moving across the earth. Ghazan Khan knows exactly what he is doing. He does not order an immediate charge. He lets the Mamluks cook in their own dread. He wants them to stare at the endless horizon of horse flesh and steel. He wants them to feel the crushing weight of their own insignificance. The Mongols begin to beat their massive kettle drums, a deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrates through the soles of the Mamluks' boots and directly into their chests. It sounds like the heartbeat of a mechanical monster waking up from a long slumber. This is the Mongol art of psychological warfare. Before they even fire a single arrow, they want you to accept that you are already dead. They want your hands to shake so badly that you cannot knock an arrow or hold a lance straight. But the Mamluk commanders are not amateurs easily broken by noise. They are veterans of a brutal, lifelong military machine. They know that panic is a highly contagious virus, and the only cure is absolute, unyielding discipline. Officers ride up and down the lines, barking orders, dressing the ranks, threatening to cut down any man who breaks formation. They form a massive, rigid wall of steel. The Mamluk heavy cavalryman is a walking fortress, draped in overlapping scales of lamella armor, wielding a heavy lance, a composite bow, a heavy mace, and a curved sword. Their horses are larger, stronger, and heavily barded compared to the smaller, unarmored Mongol ponies. In a head-on collision, a Mamluk will crush a Mongol rider into the dirt. But the Mongols do not do head-on collisions. They flow like water around a rock, looking for cracks, looking for impatience, and waiting for exhaustion. The tension on the battlefield stretches so thin it threatens to snap the minds of the men waiting in the dirt. You can smell the sour tang of nervous sweat, mixing with the scent of wet horsehair and rusted iron. The wind bites at exposed skin, but under the heavy helmets, men are suffocating from the pure adrenaline flooding their veins. The Mamluks know that the moment they commit to a charge, they will be playing directly into Ghazan Khan's hands. If they break their tight formation to chase the nimble Mongol horse archers, they will be isolated, surrounded, and cut to pieces in the dust. They have to stand there and take the punishment. They have to willingly absorb the incoming storm. And then the drumming stops. The sudden, suffocating silence is worse than the noise. It is the terrifying intake of breath before the scream. Across the wadi, the Mongol vanguard begins to move. It is not a chaotic rush. It is a slow, methodical advance, a tidal wave of archers trotting forward in perfect, terrifying synchronization. The trap is set, the chessboard of death is locked in place, and the Mamluks realize with a cold, sinking horror that there is no brilliant tactical maneuver that can save them now. There is only blood, steel, and the desperate hope that they can bleed the monster before it swallows them whole. When the first Mongol volley lands, it does not sound like a movie. There is no cinematic whoosh. It sounds like a sudden, violent hailstorm hitting a roof made of meat and iron. Thousands of arrows tipped with armor-piercing bodkin points drop from the sky at a terrifying terminal velocity. They punch through the heavy felt of the Mamluk horse armor, shatter collarbones, and pin men's boots to their saddles. The air is instantly filled with the wet, sickening thud of steel entering flesh and the high-pitched, desperate screams of dying horses. The Mongol composite bow is a masterpiece of lethal engineering. Made from horn, wood, and sinew, it has a draw weight that would dislocate the shoulder of a modern athlete. At this range, their arrows do not just injure, they amputate. They turn the Mamluk front line into a bleeding, chaotic mess. But the Mongols do not stop to admire their work. Within seconds, a second volley is already in the air, followed by a third. It is a relentless, suffocating blanket of death designed to break the enemy's nerve before the physical lines ever meet. But the Mamluks do not break. They are the anvil upon which the Mongol hammer has struck before, and they are forged from the same ruthless fire. Through the blinding dust and the agonizing cries of their comrades, the Mamluk commanders scream the order to charge. The heavy kettle drums of the Syrian army roar to life, and the wall of steel begins to move forward. This is not a glorious, romantic cavalry charge. It is a desperate, grinding push into a meat grinder. The Mamluk warhorses, massive beasts bred for pure kinetic impact, dig their hooves into the hard dirt, accelerating under the weight of heavily armored riders. They lower their lances, leaning into the storm of arrows. Men are shot out of the saddle every second, their bodies trampled into the dust by the thousands of hooves thundering right behind them. There is no time to mourn, no time to stop. If you fall, you are instantly pulverized into the earth. When the Mamluk heavy cavalry finally slams into the Mongol vanguard, the physics of the collision are catastrophic. Imagine a freight train colliding with a pack of wolves. The smaller, unarmored Mongol ponies are literally crushed under the impact. Mamluk lances splinter through leather armor, and ribs, lifting men completely out of their saddles. The Mamluk heavy maces and curved swords go to work, crushing skulls and severing limbs in a localized hurricane of hyper-violence. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it looks like the sheer brute force of the Mamluks is going to shatter the Mongols' center. But this is exactly what Ghazan Khan wants. The Mongols are masters of the feigned retreat. As the Mamluks push deeper, slaughtering everything in their path, the Mongol vanguard begins to melt away. They do not root, they evaporate. They pull back, turning in their saddles to unleash the devastating Parthian shot, firing backward at point-blank range directly into the unprotected faces and horse flanks of the pursuing Mamluks. The Mamluk charge begins to lose its momentum, bogging down in a sea of dust, corpses, and panicked, riderless horses. In this suffocating claustrophobia of combat, the intense Mamluk training takes over. These men were taken as boys and taught that pain is just an obstacle, and fear is a disease. They swing their maces with mechanical precision, their armor dented and slick with gore. But pure discipline cannot alter cold mathematics. The Mamluks realize too late that they are not breaking the Mongol army, they are being swallowed by it. The Mongol flanks, hundreds of thousands of hooves strong, begin to wrap around the edges of the Syrian army like the jaws of a giant trap. The sky is completely blotted out by dust and arrows. The noise is a physical pressure in the skull, a constant, deafening roar of metal grinding against metal. The chessboard of death has collapsed into a chaotic brawl, and the Mamluks are suddenly fighting a 360-degree war of survival against an enemy that seems to multiply in the shadows. The Battle of Kili has truly begun, and the sand is rapidly turning dark brown with the blood of two empires. There is a terrifying moment in every massacre where the math becomes undeniable. In the choking dust of Wadi al-Khazandar, the Mamluks reach that moment. They have smashed into the Mongol lines, broken bones and shattered skulls, but for every Mongol pony they trample, 3 more appear from the smoke. The arrows are no longer falling in volleys, they are a continuous deafening hiss in the air. The Mamluk commanders look at the meat grinder they are trapped in and make a calculation devoid of any romantic chivalry. If they stay, they die, not just them, but the entire army, the Sultanate, and the last beacon of their civilization. They must do the one thing that almost never works in medieval warfare. They must walk away. To understand the sheer insanity of a tactical retreat against the Mongols, you have to understand the psychology of the route. When a medieval army loses its nerve, it does not do so logically. Panic is a highly contagious disease. The moment the front line turns its back, the formation shatters. Men drop their heavy shields, throw away their weapons, and sprint for their lives, and that is exactly what the Mongols want. The Mongol war machine is specifically designed for the hunt. Once an enemy breaks, the horse archers simply ride them down like frightened game, shooting them in the back with absolute impunity. A fleeing army is not an army, it is just a buffet. But the Mamluks are not a feudal levy of terrified peasants, nor are they arrogant European knights who would rather die in a pointless charge for glory. They are a machine built on childhood trauma and supreme discipline. The heavy brass horns blow across the bleeding Mamluk lines, signaling a maneuver so difficult it borders on the suicidal. They are not running, they are executing a fighting withdrawal. The core, heavy cavalry, the irreplaceable elite veterans of the Sultanate, begin to lock their shields together and step backward. This is the art of the bleeding retreat. It is an agonizing, monstrous process. You cannot turn around. You must keep your eyes locked on the nightmare. You step backward over the mutilated bodies of your own brothers. You listen to the wounded screaming for help from the dirt, and you leave them behind because breaking formation to drag a dying man to safety means the entire line collapses. The Mamluk rearguard becomes a moving wall of iron and meat designed solely to absorb the relentless punishment of the pursuing Mongols. Arrows thud into their wooden shields, punch through their lamellar armor, and drop their massive warhorses by the dozen. Every step backward costs them a gallon of blood. Ghazan Khan watches this from his vantage point and smells blood in the water. He thinks the animal is dying. He orders his massive cavalry wings to close in, to tighten the noose and turn this agonizing withdrawal into a chaotic slaughter. The Mongol pressure intensifies, a suffocating swarm of thousands of horsemen snapping at the heels of the Mamluk rearguard, firing point-blank into the retreating mass. The noise is a chaotic blend of cracking wood, snapping bowstrings, and the desperate wet sounds of men choking on their own blood in the sand. Yet, the Mamluk iron block does not shatter. Their conditioning overrides their basic human survival instincts. They move at a grueling, methodical pace, willfully trading their own flesh for distance. The Mamluks know that honor is a useless concept if your empire burns to the ground. Surviving to fight another day is the ultimate strategic victory. They are deliberately allowing Ghazan Khan to push them, allowing him to think he has broken them, while they slowly, painfully drag the entire Mongol war machine deeper and deeper into the unforgiving Syrian wasteland. The illusion of a total Mongol victory is taking shape on the battlefield, but it is an illusion built on a foundation of profound Mamluk sacrifice. They are losing the battle exactly the way they need to. To truly grasp the terrifying genius of the Mamluk strategy, you have to stop looking at the men and start looking at the animals. The true engine of the Mongol apocalypse was not the composite bow, and it was not their brutal discipline. It was the Mongol pony. These were tough, rugged, incredibly resilient beasts bred on the harsh Eurasian steppes. They could survive on almost nothing, dig through snow to find grass, and carry a warrior for days on end. But surviving on almost nothing is not the same as surviving on literally nothing. Ghazan Khan brought well over 100,000 of these animals into the Syrian desert in the dead of winter. That is a massive biological machine that requires thousands of tons of forage and water every single day just to keep its heart beating, and the Mamluks are about to pull the plug on that machine. As the heavy cavalry of the Mamluk rearguard bleeds and dies to buy distance, the rest of the Syrian army is not simply running away. They are busy erasing the earth. This is the dark, unglamorous reality of medieval logistics warfare. It is the strategy of the scorched earth, and the Mamluks execute it with a cold, sadistic efficiency. They set fire to every single patch of dry winter grass on their path south. They slaughter the local livestock they cannot carry and throw the rotting, bleeding carcasses down the wells to instantly poison the water supply. They smash the ancient irrigation ditches and burn the grain silos. They are actively tearing down their own infrastructure, ensuring that they leave absolutely 0 calories behind for the pursuing horde. Put yourself in the saddle of a pursuing Mongol rider. The adrenaline of the initial slaughter at Kili is finally fading. Your horse is panting heavily, its thick coat matted with freezing sweat, dust, and blood. You have been pushing it to the absolute physical limit, assuming you will water it at the nearest captured oasis once the enemy routs. But when you finally arrive, the oasis is a smoking, barren crater of black ash and dead dogs. You desperately push toward the next village well. It is completely filled to the brim with sand, rocks, and chopped-up camel meat. You look down at your horse, the very creature your life depends on, and you see the horrible, undeniable panic in its eyes. The animal is starving, Driven mad by thirst and hunger, it begins to gnaw frantically at the frozen, scorched dirt, desperately chewing on burnt roots that offer absolutely no nourishment. The Mamluks understand a fundamental law of physics that Ghazan Khan's blinding hubris has made him forget. You cannot feed a horse with military glory. You can win every cavalry skirmish, you can occupy all the empty ground, and you can pile the enemy's skulls as high as a mountain, but if your logistics chain does not exist, your invincible army is nothing more than a walking corpse. The Mongol war machine relies entirely on perpetual motion to terrorize its enemies, but without fuel, motion stops. Within days of the supposed victory at Kili, a new, awful sound begins to echo across the Syrian wasteland. It is the sound of thousands of horses dying. They begin to collapse in the middle of the march, their ribs showing through their coats, their lungs seizing up from profound exhaustion and malnutrition. The Mongols are forced to slit the throats of their own mounts to drink their blood, but a starving horse yields little sustenance. When a Mongol pony dies, the rider loses everything. He loses his transport, his tactical advantage, and his psychological invincibility. A Mongol warrior without a horse is no longer the apex predator of the medieval world. He is just a freezing, terrified man wearing too much armor, stranded in a desert that is actively trying to kill him. The Mamluks are willingly burning their own homeland to the ground, trading their own economic future to turn the Syrian environment into a colossal, unavoidable death trap. They are letting the geography do the butchering that their swords could not finish. The capture of Damascus should feel like walking into a trap that has already sprung. The sky is grey, the wind is brutally cold. Ghazan Khan rides through the gates of the ancient city and believes he has cemented his legacy as a god of war. By early 1300, the Mongols are technically the undisputed masters of Syria. The Mamluk army is gone, having retreated all the way back to the safety of Egypt. To the naked eye, the Ilkhanate has achieved its ultimate, long-sought goal. The Mongol banners flutter from the highest towers, and the Friday prayers in the Great Mosque are declared in the name of the Khan. It looks like a total, world-shaking victory. But the victory is a complete illusion. It is a beautiful, glittering facade painted over a rotting, infected wound. When a medieval army conquers a territory, they expect a specific reward. They expect to violently plunder the granaries, slaughter the local livestock, and gorge themselves on the agricultural wealth of the defeated. They expect their exhausted, battered war horses to finally rest, standing belly deep in fresh hay and clean water. But when the massive Mongol horde attempts to spread out across the Syrian countryside to forage, they step into a barren, blackened wasteland. The Mamluks had executed their scorched earth policy with terrifying, uncompromising perfection. There are no granaries to plunder because the grain has been burned to cinders. There are no sheep or cattle to butcher because their bloated, rotting carcasses have been deliberately thrown into the local wells, poisoning the only sources of drinking water for miles. Ghazan Khan sits on a stolen throne inside the citadel of Damascus, surrounded by the incredible, legendary wealth of the Levant. His generals bring him heavy chests overflowing with gold dinars, silver jewelry, and vibrant precious silks. They have captured the ultimate prize of the Middle East. But a horrifying, cold reality begins to dawn on the Mongol High Command. You cannot eat silk. You cannot feed solid gold coins to a starving horse. The immense, glittering wealth of Damascus is absolutely useless in the face of a total logistical collapse. The Mongol warriors are rapidly becoming the richest starving men on the face of the planet. Outside the thick stone walls of the palace, the situation devolves into a grotesque, uncontrollable nightmare. The once proud Mongol veterans, the terrifying, disciplined horsemen who had shattered the Mamluk lines at Kili just weeks prior, are now reduced to pathetic, desperate scavengers. They wander aimlessly through the freezing, windswept plains of Syria, using their weapons to dig frantically through the frozen, scorched mud in search of unburned roots or a handful of untainted water. The invincible army is slowly, painfully disintegrating. They are not falling under the weight of an enemy ambush, but under the slow, crushing pressure of basic biology. The horses, the very lifeblood of the Mongol Empire, are dying by the thousands every single day. Without their mounts, the Mongols are entirely stranded, transformed from the fastest military force on earth into a sluggish, freezing mass of heavy infantry. The streets of Damascus and the massive encampments outside the city walls become choked with the huge, rotting corpses of steppe ponies. The overpowering stench of decomposing flesh hangs heavy over the region, a constant, nauseating reminder of their catastrophic strategic failure. This is the ultimate graveyard of hubris. Ghazan Khan genuinely believed that his tactical genius and the sheer, overwhelming brutality of his massive army could conquer the basic laws of nature. He believed that violence was the only currency that mattered. But the Mamluks understood a deeper, much darker truth of warfare. They understood that an army is only as terrifying as its stomach is full. By willingly turning their own homeland into a toxic, burning weapon, the Mamluks had successfully trapped the Mongols in a massive, open-air prison. The Ilkhanate had marched aggressively into Syria expecting a glorious, easy slaughter, but they found themselves slowly suffocating in a vacuum. The legendary discipline of the Mongol ranks begins to violently fracture. Men who had fought side by side across a dozen bloody campaigns are now drawing their blades on each other over a single handful of rotting, mouldy grain. The invincible war machine is tearing itself apart from the inside, proving that even the most terrifying empire in human history can be brought to its knees by the simple, agonizing reality of an empty, unforgiving landscape. The freezing rain of early 1300 turns the scorched Syrian dirt into a freezing, toxic sludge. In the heart of Damascus, Ghazan Khan is a prisoner of his own success. He sits in a conquered palace wrapped in heavy furs, listening to a sound that strikes more terror into a Mongol heart than any enemy war cry. It is the sound of absolute, suffocating silence. The deafening roar of his massive cavalry, the terrifying heartbeat of his empire, has stopped. His generals do not bring him battle plans anymore. They bring him casualty reports of men who have frozen to death in their sleep and horses that have collapsed from sheer starvation. The great Ilkhanate, the most feared military force on the planet, is being slowly, systematically erased by the weather and an empty stomach. To understand the depth of Ghazan Khan's dilemma, you have to understand the Mongol psychology of victory. The Mongols did not just conquer territory, they possessed it. They believed it was their divine right, granted by the eternal blue sky, to rule the entire earth. To retreat from a conquered land, especially after utterly destroying the enemy army in a pitched battle like Kili, was not just a strategic humiliation. It was a theological crisis. It meant the heavens had turned against them. But the mathematics of survival are completely indifferent to theology. Ghazan Khan looks at his army and realizes the horrifying truth of the Mamluk trap. The Mamluks did not run away in panic. They left him holding a ticking time bomb, and the timer has just hit 0. Ghazan Khan had spent his entire life mastering the art of the offensive. He knew how to break walls, how to slaughter kings, and how to burn cities, but nothing in his brutal education had prepared him for an enemy that weaponized the very absence of war. He is fighting a war of attrition against a ghost, and the ghost is winning. The starvation within the Mongol camps outside the city walls has reached a state of pure, apocalyptic horror. The legendary discipline that forged an empire out of the steppes has completely evaporated. The men are no longer warriors. They are desperate, dying animals. They begin boiling the leather of their own armor, chewing on their own bowstrings just to put something in their stomachs. When a horse finally drops dead, it is instantly swarmed by dozens of freezing men, hacking at the emaciated carcass with their swords, drinking the stagnant freezing blood before it coagulates. The great Mongol war machine has been reduced to a grotesque cannibalistic mob, turning on itself in the mud of a foreign land. Ghazan knows that if he stays in Syria until the spring, he will not have an army left. The Mamluks, waiting safely down south in the fertile, untouched lands of Egypt, know this too. They are simply watching the clock, letting the brutal Syrian winter do the butchering for them. Every single day Ghazan remains in Damascus, his power diminishes. The psychological pressure on the Khan is immense. He has to make the most painful, humiliating decision of his life. He must order the greatest army in the world to pack up its starving remnants and run away. He summons his surviving commanders. The men who enter his chamber are no longer the arrogant, bloodthirsty conquerors who crossed the Euphrates months ago. They are hollow-eyed, freezing, and broken. Ghazan gives the order to abandon Syria. It is a death sentence for his prestige. He leaves behind a general with a token garrison, a pathetic handful of doomed men who are too weak to march, essentially sacrificing them to slow down the inevitable Mamluk return. The main body of the Ilkhanate army begins a grueling, pathetic death march back toward the Euphrates River. As the massive, starving columns begin their trek north, the road becomes a continuous, frozen graveyard. Men simply sit down in the snow and never get back up. They abandon their heavy steel armor, dropping the magnificent weapons that had terrorized the world, just to lighten their load by a few pounds. They leave behind the incredible wealth of Damascus, taking only what they can carry. The invincible Mongols are not retreating in glory. They are crawling away to survive. The Mamluk strategy of the bleeding retreat and the scorched earth has worked with absolute, terrifying perfection. Spring in the Levant of 1300 does not arrive with blooming flowers and gentle rains. It arrives with the suffocating stench of thawing meat. As the winter snows finally melt across the Syrian wasteland, they reveal the true, horrifying cost of Ghazan Khan's arrogance. The retreat route of the Ilkhanate army is a continuous graveyard stretching for hundreds of miles back toward the Euphrates River. It is littered with the frozen, emaciated corpses of tens of thousands of steppe ponies and the men who rode them. The greatest, most terrifying military machine on the planet has been chewed up and spat out by the very dirt they claimed to conquer. But while the surviving Mongols are crawling back to their borders in absolute disgrace, a very different reality is taking shape 500 miles to the south. Down in Cairo, the Mamluk army is not mourning a defeat. They are rearming for an execution. The agonizing, bleeding retreat at Wadi al-Khazandar was a traumatic sacrifice, but it achieved its exact, calculated purpose. The core of the Mamluk heavy cavalry, the irreplaceable, lifelong veterans who form the absolute spine of the Sultanate, are alive. They have spent the brutal winter resting in the warm, endlessly fertile delta of the Nile. Their massive war horses are well fed on abundant grain. Their heavy lamella armor is repaired, polished, and ready. Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad and his ruthless commanders never panicked when they handed Syria over to the horde. They simply watched the calendar, trusting the cold, unforgiving mathematics of starvation to fight their war for them. When the weather finally breaks, the Mamluk war machine marches north again. This time, they are not marching into a suffocating meat grinder of arrows. They are marching in as the undisputed apex predators of a devastated ecosystem, As they cross back into the Levant, they find the terrifying Mongol horde reduced to a pathetic, starving shadow. Ghazan Khan had left a token garrison behind in Damascus, a sacrificial rearguard of freezing men expected to maintain the fragile illusion of an Ilkhanate victory. The Mamluks do not offer them a glorious pitched battle. They simply roll over them like a tidal wave of iron. The recapture of Syria is less of a traditional military campaign and more of a brutal, systemic extermination. The Mongol stragglers, weakened by months of dysentery, frostbite, and severe malnutrition, are in no physical or psychological condition to face the rested, furious Mamluk heavy cavalry. The hunters have officially become the hunted. The Mamluks systematically track down the remaining Ilkhanate forces, showing absolutely zero mercy to the men who had forced them into the dirt at Kili. The same Syrian soldiers who had to step backward over the mutilated bodies of their brothers now unleash a winter's worth of pent-up, localized rage. The streets and citadels of Damascus are violently scrubbed clean with Mongol blood. But the true, world-shifting victory here is not just the recapture of a few cities. It is the absolute, permanent destruction of a psychological weapon. For nearly a century, the Mongol Empire had expanded on one simple, paralyzing premise. They were an unstoppable force of nature, and resisting them was a biological impossibility. If you beat them once, they came back with 10 times the numbers and erased your civilization from the history books. But the Mamluks have just proved to the entire world that the monster can be starved. Ghazan Khan threw the absolute maximum weight of his fractured empire at the Mamluk Sultanate. He won the tactical engagement, he occupied the capital city, and he still lost the war in the most humiliating way imaginable. The Mamluk resurrection sends a violent shockwave through the medieval world. It proves that the Mongol war machine is a hyper-aggressive, momentum-based predator that simply cannot survive a war of pure logistical attrition. By willingly burning their own lands and retreating into the safety of Egypt, the Mamluks broke the spine of the Ilkhanate's expansion forever, turning the Mongol myth of invincibility into just another rotting corpse in the Syrian sand. The history books often record the Battle of Kili as a Mongol victory. If you look purely at a tactical map of 1299, Ghazan Khan won. He shattered the enemy line, occupied the capital of Damascus, and forced a massive retreat. But the ghosts of 100,000 starving horses buried in the freezing Syrian mud tell an entirely different story. Kili is a masterclass in the grim, deeply unglamorous reality of medieval warfare. It proves that military glory is a completely useless currency when the temperature drops and the granaries are empty. You cannot conquer geography with arrogance. When we think of the great clashes of empires, we imagine brilliant cavalry charges, heroic last stands, and kings crossing swords. We do not imagine the slow, pathetic agony of freezing to death while chewing on boiled leather armor. But that is the actual fabric of history. The Mamluks did not defeat the Mongols at Kili with a miraculous counterattack. They defeated them with a horrific, mathematically calculated sacrifice. They understood a terrifying truth. To save their civilization, they had to be willing to burn their own homeland to ashes. They traded their ego, their wealth, and their immediate comfort for the ultimate prize of survival. Ghazan Khan never fully recovered from the humiliation of this logistical nightmare. The psychological damage inflicted by the Mamluk retreat was permanent. The invincible aura of the Ilkhanate was shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that their massive armies were incredibly fragile biological machines that could be turned off simply by removing their fuel. Ghazan would attempt to invade Syria again a few years later, in 1303, at the Battle of Marj al-Safar. But this time, the Mamluks did not retreat. They stood their ground and annihilated the weakened, demoralized Mongol army, permanently slamming the door shut on Mongol expansion into the Middle East. Ghazan Khan died shortly after, his dream of a unified global empire rotting away just like his horses in the Syrian desert. The Battle of Kili remains one of the most brilliant, ruthless, and overlooked strategic victories in human history. It teaches us a brutal lesson about power and leverage. The biggest, most terrifying monster in the room is not always defeated by a sharper sword. Sometimes it is defeated by a disciplined step backward, a scorched field, and the absolute unwavering patience to let the monster starve itself to death. True tactical genius is knowing exactly when to let your enemy overextend, step into the trap, and collapse under the crushing weight of their own hubris. If you made it this far, you are clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our past. If this story of survival, logistics, and ruthless strategy resonated with you, please hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed with the bell notification turned on. We are building a library of history's most incredible forgotten moments, and I want you to be a part of it. And before you go, I have a question for you to answer in the comments. In a war for absolute survival, do you think the Mamluk scorched earth strategy, which destroyed the livelihoods of their own citizens to starve the enemy, was a necessary evil or an unforgivable cruelty? Let the debate begin below. If you want to understand exactly how the Mamluks first broke the Mongol myth of invincibility decades earlier, click the video on your screen right now to explore the bloodbath at the Battle of Ain Jalut. Until next time, remember, history isn't just a list of dates and victors, it's a warning from the dead.